This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 33. This chapter isn't so much a prophecy of a specific event that'll take place, but more a statement of what God will do in general. Verse 1. Woe to you who destroy, but you weren't destroyed, and who betray, but nobody betrayed you. When you've finished destroying, you'll be destroyed, and when you've finished betrayal, you'll be betrayed. Yahweh, be gracious to us. We've waited for you. Be our strength every morning, our salvation also in the time of trouble. At the noise of the thunder, the peoples have fled. When you lift yourself up, the nations are scattered. Your plunder will be gathered as the caterpillar gathers. Men will leap on it as locusts leap. Comment in verse 1, Woe to the aggressor who destroys and betrays without provocation. He'll be destroyed and betrayed. In verse 2, Yahweh, be gracious to us. We wait for you. Be our strength every day and our salvation in time of trouble. In verse 3, Lord, when you thunder in your power and anger, the foreign troops scatter. When you lift yourself up, they run for their lives. In verse 4, God's people will consume their enemies like caterpillars consume leaves. They'll leap on their plunder as locusts leap. They'll consume the plunder as locusts consume. Verse 5. Yahweh is exalted, for he dwells on high. He's filled Zion with justice and righteousness. There'll be stability in your times, abundance of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. The fear of Yahweh is your treasure. Comment in verse 5, Yahweh has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. Zion is an actual hill in Jerusalem, but ever since the day David put the ark there, the idea of Zion was that God inhabited it. He was there protecting his people. The Israelites knew he was present in all the universe, yet he paid particular loving attention to his people from Zion. It's a place of justice and righteousness in verse 5. Verse 6 is consistently translated the same as in our translation, quote, There will be stability in your times, abundance of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge, end quote. It's a remarkable promise because there can be complete outward chaos in our times, yet we'll have stability in God. We'll have abundance of salvation and wisdom and knowledge to handle whatever. Just as God saw Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through all their chaos, through their foreign travels, famines, hostilities, and even through their own failings, so he'll see us through with stability in our times. The fear of Yahweh is our treasure in verse 6. We fear God and not circumstances. Speaking of nations without God, verse 7, Behold, their valiant ones cry outside. The ambassadors of peace weep bitterly. The highways are desolate. The traveling man ceases. The covenant is broken. He's despised the cities. He doesn't respect man. The land mourns and languishes. Lebanon is confounded and withers away. Sharon is like a desert, and Bashan and Carmel are stripped bare. Comment in verses 7 and 9 with respect to proud and godless nations and regions, a few examples being Lebanon, Sharon, Bashan, and Carmel. Their valiant ones will end up crying in verse 7. Their ambassadors who demand God's people to surrender will weep. Their unprovoked destruction and betrayal of God's people will backfire on them according to the principles stated in verse 1. God doesn't respect man in verse 8. It's not that some were born in Israel that he loves and some were born in Lebanon that he hates. He doesn't respect, meaning he doesn't discriminate. They break covenant in verse 8. The foreign nations didn't have a written covenant with God, but there's always been the basic universal covenant, the basic understanding that we don't attack if we're not attacked and don't betray if not betrayed, and so on and so forth, just basic morality that God expects from everyone. When we meet a complete stranger on the street anywhere in the world, he knows not to attack without provocation and not to betray, and he knows all the other basics. When people and nations violate that basic and understood covenant, they break with God. God has no respect for them. He'll desolate their cities and highways, town and country in verse 8. They'll mourn and languish in verse 9. Verse 10, Now I will arise, says Yahweh. Now I will lift myself up. Now I'll be exalted. Comment, God's arising against those who break covenant. He says to them, verse 11, You will conceive chaff. You'll give birth to stubble. Your breath is a fire that will devour you. The peoples will be like the burning of lime, like thorns that are cut down and burned in the fire. Hear, you who are far off, what I've done, and you who are near, acknowledge my might. The sinners in Zion are afraid. Trembling has seized the godless ones. Comment in verse 14, it's not just Gentiles, it's also sinners in Zion who break covenant. When God rises up, the sinners of Zion are afraid, and trembling seizes them. The coming passage is understandable, still in verse 14. Who among us can live with the devouring fire? Who among us can live with everlasting burning? He who walks righteously and speaks blamelessly, he who despises the gain of oppressions, who gestures with his hands, refusing to take a bribe, who stops his ears from hearing of blood and shuts his eyes from looking at evil, he will dwell on high. His place of defense will be the fortress of rocks. His bread will be supplied. His waters will be sure. Your eyes will see the king in his beauty. They'll see a distant land. Comment in verse 15, the righteous gestures with his hands that he won't take a bribe. We get the picture. He's been shown the money, but he waves it off with both hands to indicate he won't accept it. He who walks righteously will dwell with God on high. God will supply the righteous with protection, bread, and water, and the righteous will see the king in his beauty in a distant land. Coming up, when the righteous looks back on everything, he'll meditate on the terrors that befell the wicked. Verse 18. Your heart will meditate on the terror. Where is he who counted? Where is he who weighed? Where is he who counted the towers? You'll no longer see the fierce people, a people of deep speech that you can't comprehend, with a strange language that you can't understand. Comment in verses 18 and 19, a fierce foreign nation attacked a weaker nation and imposed tribute. An official from that nation collected the tribute on a regular basis. He weighed out the silver and gold. He counted the towers, which probably means he taxed each city according to how many towers were on the wall. But after God rose up, what became of the tax collector and what became of his nation? What kind of terror did they experience in verse 18? But as to the righteous, verse 20, look at Zion, the city of our appointed festivals. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tent that won't be removed. Its stakes will never be plucked up, nor will any of its cords be broken. But there Yahweh will be with us in majesty, a place of wide rivers and streams, in which no galley with oars will go, neither will any gallant ship pass by there. For Yahweh is our judge, Yahweh is our lawgiver, Yahweh is our king, he'll save us. Your rigging is untied. They couldn't strengthen the foot of their mast. They couldn't spread the sail. Then the prey of a great plunder was divided. The lame took the prey. The inhabitant won't say, I'm sick. The people who dwell therein will be forgiven their iniquity. Comment in verse 20, look at Zion, the city of our appointed festivals, end quote. The law of Moses called for Israel to gather in Jerusalem 3 times per year, if possible, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, First Fruits, and Ingathering, Exodus 23:14. Those were the appointed festivals of verse 20. They were celebrations in the Lord. Those festivals were snapshots of the future. They were prophetic of that future time when we gather together with God and with each other. The righteous can look forward to continual celebration with God and each other. Zion and Jerusalem won't be removed. As if Zion were a big tent, her stakes won't be plucked up or any of her cords be broken. She's not going anywhere. But in verse 21, quote, Yahweh will be with us there in his majesty, end quote. There will be plenty of water from wide rivers, which didn't exist in Jerusalem in Isaiah's time and still don't exist in the present age. There was only the Gihon Spring and the Upper Spring and the associated water system. But in that day there will be wide rivers. In Zechariah 14:8, quote, it will happen in that day that living waters will go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and half of them toward the western sea. In summer and in winter will it be, end quote. So that's living waters proceeding from Jerusalem, half going east, half going west, and wide rivers in verse 21, assuming it's the same water here in Isaiah as it was in Zechariah. These are supernatural rivers and a supernatural day. The righteous will see it. In verse 21, no galley ship propelled by oars will pass by Jerusalem. Galley ships were invented long before Isaiah, and by Isaiah's time, the Phoenicians of Lebanon had invented the bireme, which is a galley ship with 2 banks of oars. It had military potential, But in that day, when in that coming day, those ships won't pass by Jerusalem. There'll be no war or foreign attacks, no ships coming up those wide rivers. Yahweh will save us from all that kind of thing in that day in verse 22. He'll confound the foreigner in verse 23. Foreigners won't be able to tie their ship's rigging, keep the base of the mast in place, or spread the sail. They'll be impotent to wage war, in other words. God's people will divide the plunder in that day, not foreigners. The lame took the prey. Then the last verse, the inhabitant of Zion won't say, I'm sick. The people who live there will be forgiven. Isaiah 34 is next.